Somewhere in the American West, a river is disappearing. Not all at once, not dramatically, not with the kind of sudden violence that makes the news and forces a response. It is disappearing the way most real crises happen, slowly, incrementally, in measurements and percentages and water levels that drop a little further each year, each decade, until the distance between where the water is and where it needs to be becomes something that can no longer be managed by the agreements and infrastructure that were built when the river was something else entirely. 40 million people depend on this river, not in an abstract ecological sense, in a direct daily infrastructural sense. The water that comes out of their taps, the electricity that powers their cities, the food grown in the fields that feed the country. All of it connected through a system of dams and reservoirs and canals and compacts and century-old legal agreements to a single river running through the driest landscape in North America, the Colorado River. And it is running out. To understand what that means, what it actually means, not in a policy sense, but in a physical, structural, inevitable sense, you have to understand what the Colorado River actually is. Not just as a geographic feature, but as a system, because that is what it became over the course of the 20th century. Not a river, a machine. The most engineered, most allocated, most legally complicated river in the world. And like any machine, it has limits, and those limits are being tested right now in ways that most of the 40 million people who depend on it have not been asked to fully reckon with. The Colorado River begins in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado. It runs 1,400 miles through some of the most dramatic landscape on the continent, through canyons, desert plateaus, and the corners of 7 states before it reaches, or used to reach, the Gulf of California. It no longer reliably makes it that far. The water is consumed long before the river reaches the sea. The water is diverted, allocated, used, and redistributed across a network of infrastructure that took a century to build, and that now stands as one of the great engineering achievements of American history. Lake Mead, Lake Powell, the Hoover Dam, the Glen Canyon Dam, the Central Arizona Project, the All-American Canal. These are not just landmarks, they are the load-bearing walls of the American Southwest. Lake Mead, formed by the Hoover Dam on the Nevada-Arizona border, is the largest reservoir in the United States by volume. It stores water for Nevada, Arizona, and California. It generates hydroelectric power for millions of homes. It is the physical embodiment of the promise that the Colorado River made to the cities and farms and industries of the Southwest, that the water would be there, that the lights would stay on, that the desert could bloom. Las Vegas gets roughly 90% of its water from Lake Mead. Phoenix, one of the fastest growing cities in the country, depends on Colorado River water delivered through a canal system that stretches 300 miles across the desert. Los Angeles, through a complex web of water rights and transfer agreements, draws on the river as part of the infrastructure that keeps a city of 4 million functioning in a coastal desert. The farms of the Imperial Valley in California, some of the most productive agricultural land in the world and producing a significant share of the country's vegetables, are irrigated almost entirely by Colorado River water. And the river that all of this depends on is, by every measurable standard, shrinking. The decline of the Colorado River is not a new story. The warning signs have been visible for decades, but the speed and severity of what has happened in the last 20 years has moved the conversation from concern to crisis. Lake Mead has dropped from a full pool elevation of 1,229 feet to levels that, at their lowest point in 2022, approached 1,040 feet. That was a decline of nearly 200 feet. When you stand at the Hoover Dam and look at the white bathtub ring of mineral deposits on the canyon walls above the current water line, you are looking at the physical record of the disappearing water. That ring is not subtle, it is visible from miles away. It is the most honest graph of the crisis that exists. Lake Powell, the second largest reservoir in the system, reached its own record lows around the same period. At points, it dropped close to what engineers call minimum power pool, the level below which the Glen Canyon Dam can no longer generate electricity. The dam powers homes across Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, and Nebraska. When engineers began discussing the possibility that it might stop generating power, it was not a theoretical conversation. It was an operational one. Contingency plans were drawn up. Alternative power sources were assessed. The infrastructure of an entire region was being stress tested in real time. But here is where the story becomes something more than a drought story, because droughts end. What does not end, what cannot end without a fundamental restructuring of agreements that have governed this river for a century, is the overallocation problem. In 1922, the 7 states of the Colorado River Basin signed the Colorado River Compact. It divided the river's water between the upper basin states, Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, and New Mexico, and the lower basin states, Arizona, California, and Nevada. The amount of water allocated was based on flow measurements taken during an unusually wet period in the early 20th century. Negotiators divided what they believed was a reliable annual flow of approximately 17.5 million acre-feet. The actual long-term average flow of the Colorado River, measured across centuries using tree ring data and geological records, and is closer to 13 or 14 million acre-feet. The compact allocated water that the river in an average year does not produce. This was not fraud, it was optimism combined with incomplete data. But the consequence a century later is a river that has been legally promised to more users than it can physically supply, even in a good year. Even without drought, even without climate change, the system was overallocated before the first dam was built. And now, with temperatures rising across the watershed, snowpack declining, and evaporation increasing from the reservoirs themselves, the gap between what the river is promised to deliver and what it can actually deliver is wider than it has ever been. If you find these deep breakdowns valuable, take a second to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you do not miss what is coming next. And drop a comment. I read everything. The political consequences of that gap are already visible. In 2022, the federal government declared the first ever water shortage on the Colorado River, triggering mandatory cuts to Arizona and Nevada's allocations. Arizona, which holds junior water rights under the priority system that governs the river, bore the largest cuts. Farmers in the Pinal County agricultural region received notice that their Colorado River water deliveries would be reduced or eliminated. Fields that had been producing cotton and alfalfa and other crops for generations went fallow. Farmers drilled deeper into groundwater reserves that are themselves being drawn down faster than they recharge. The cuts were real. The impact was real. And the cuts made in 2022 were described by water managers as the beginning of a process, not the resolution of one. The tension between states is not abstract. Arizona, Nevada, California, and the upper basin states all have competing claims, competing priorities, and competing political pressures. The doctrine of prior appropriation, the legal framework that governs Western water rights, summarized as first in time, first in right, means that junior water rights holders get cut first and deepest. The politics of who gets cut and when and by how much is one of the most combustible ongoing disputes in American resource management. Negotiations that were supposed to produce new operating guidelines for the post-2026 period have proceeded with the kind of urgency that large multi-party, multi-billion-dollar infrastructure negotiations always produce. which is to say slowly, carefully, and with an acute awareness that any agreement will leave someone significantly worse off than they were before. Now consider what happens if the levels drop further, not just back to where they were in 2022, but further. There is a concept in reservoir management called Deadpool. It is exactly what it sounds like. It is the level at which water can no longer flow through the dam's outlet works by gravity, the level at which the reservoir becomes, for practical purposes, a lake with no exit. Lake Mead's Deadpool elevation is approximately 895 feet. In 2022, it was above 1,040 feet. That sounds like a comfortable margin, but the trajectory of the decline, measured across years of drought and overuse, makes that margin feel less comfortable when you consider that it was crossed in the wrong direction by nearly 200 feet in roughly 2 decades. The same rate of decline, sustained, does not leave an enormous amount of time. At Deadpool, the Hoover Dam stops generating electricity. The water deliveries that depend on gravity flow through the dam's infrastructure stop. Las Vegas, which has invested heavily in water conservation and has built an intake pipe that can draw water from lower in the reservoir than the original infrastructure allowed, has prepared for low water scenarios more seriously than almost any other city in the region. But Las Vegas's preparation cannot compensate for the failure of the broader system. If the dam stops generating power, the power grid serving the region is disrupted. If the water stops flowing through the dam, the communities downstream that depend on that flow face a supply interruption that no amount of local conservation can bridge. Agriculture would be the first sector to feel a Deadpool scenario at scale. The farms of the Imperial Valley, of Arizona's agricultural regions, and of the other river-dependent growing areas of the Southwest would face water cuts of a severity that would restructure the American food supply in ways that would reach every grocery store in the country. The vegetables, the citrus, the cotton, the livestock feed, all of it dependent on water that would no longer be arriving in the volumes that make those operations viable. And the cities would follow, not immediately, not overnight. Cities have storage, they have contingency plans, they have the political and financial resources to find alternative sources at a price. But the alternative sources are themselves stressed. The groundwater that would be the next line of defense is being drawn down across the region. The recycled water programs that are increasingly important are valuable but insufficient at the scale that Deadpool conditions would require. The system does not fail all at once. That is the thing that makes this kind of crisis so difficult to respond to, so easy to delay addressing, so consistently underestimated by the people whose job it is to respond to it. It fails the way the water level drops, gradually, incrementally, one record low at a time, one mandatory cut at a time, one contingency plan activated at a time, until the cumulative weight of all the gradual failures produces something that looks, in retrospect, sudden. The Colorado River is still flowing. Lake Mead is still storing water. The Hoover Dam is still generating power. Las Vegas is still lit up at night. Phoenix is still growing. The farms of the Imperial Valley are still producing. The system is still working. That sentence, the system is still working, is both completely true and the most misleading thing you could say about the situation. Because the system is working the way a structure works when the load it is carrying is approaching the limit it was built to bear. It is working. The cracks are not yet visible from the outside. The lights are on. The water is running. Everything looks fine. The river does not look like it is disappearing. It looks like a river, but the bathtub ring on the walls of the Hoover Dam does not lie. The white mineral stain climbing 200 feet above the current water line is not a projection. It is not a model. It is not a worst case scenario. It is the physical record of water that was there and is no longer there. It is the most honest document the American West has produced in a generation. 40 million people are downstream of that record, and the river that they depend on is not what it was. It is not what the compact said it would be. It is not what the dams were built to assume. It is something smaller and warmer and less reliable, carrying less water each decade than the decade before, and still being asked to do everything it has always done for more people than it has ever served, in a climate it was never designed for. The system still works, for now.